Good afternoon, miigwech, bonjour, buenas tardes. My name is Michael O'Sullivan, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our panel presentation titled Decolonizing International Service Learning, International Experiential Education, Creating North-South Allyship through Egalitarian Partnerships. I would like to begin by acknowledging the fact that all of us on this panel are non-Indigenous individuals who live on the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations across this vast country. Going from east to west, panelist Ashley Reary lives in Nova Scotia, the territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Harry Smaller lives in Toronto, the homeland of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Wendat people. I live in the Niagara region, the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. And Luke Heiderecht lives in the city of Saskatoon in Saskatchewan, the traditional territory of the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dakota, and the Assiniboine people. The Métis people live on all of these territories. I'm glad to be chairing this session, and I will be co-presenting. I am an associate professor of international and comparative education at Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario, in Canada. Our presentation is going to be translated into Spanish. It is being recorded and will be available on the symposium's YouTube site tomorrow. Each panelist will take a few minutes to present, and time permitting, we will invite questions. I will now ask each presenter to say a few words about themselves in the order that they will be speaking. Our first speaker is Harry Smaller.
Yeah, hi there. I'm a retired professor from York University in education. I've been involved with international education for quite a while.
Thank you, Harry. Our second speaker is Luke Heiderecht.
Hi, everybody. I live here in Saskatoon, as Mike mentioned, and I work with an Indigenous health and wellness research group here and as a project coordinator. And I've been also working with these folks on some of the work that we've been doing in Nicaragua and Guatemala. So glad to be here.
And I'm the third speaker, but I've already introduced myself. So I'll now ask our fourth speaker, Ashley Reary, to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Good afternoon. My name is Ashley Reary. I have a master's degree in development studies from York University and worked with Harry Smaller and Mike and Luke many years ago. I'm currently working in the grant-making team with an organization called Equality Fund.
Thank you, Ashley. So I will now ask Harry Smaller to begin our panel.
Yes, indeed. First slide, Luke. Are we going to be able to see these slides, see what's happening? There we are.
There we go.
Okay. And now the second slide. So our interest in researching the effects of international experiential education on villages and villagers in the South evolved over several years, mainly as a result of our own long-standing involvement with the Global Education Project in Central America. Slide. Next slide. In our work, we became increasingly aware of signals that not everything about this program was ideal. Next slide. There were occasional hints from some villagers that things could be better, but we also identified deeper concerns. Next slide. Although we rarely expressed openly with the way in which the visits and service projects were planned and undertaken. On this basis, we designed and undertook a research project to explore these issues. Next slide. We agreed that a crucial component of our research was that it would be based on the voices of the residents themselves, as well as others who had worked on the ground within the relevant projects. Thus, we met with willing communities to explain our research intentions in the hopes of gaining their permission for us to engage in this inquiry. These meetings were instructive in themselves. Following our initial presentations, the village participants not only posed a number of questions, but also expressed many suggestions, indeed requirements, about how this research might be most effective. Chief among these recommendations were, first, that their voices would indeed be heard, and second, that the results of our research would be shared with them. Clearly, these were requests that we had no problem in guaranteeing. Thankfully, all the communities subsequently agreed to allow us to engage in this research. For this research, we worked with a Nicaraguan anthropologist who was part of our team and who had arranged to spend considerable time in each of 4 villages, each of which had had ISL visits and with which the authors had had connections. Central to this methodology would be in-depth interviews with a range of residents. Where possible, focus groups would also be convened, particularly to ensure the inclusion of specific groups, such as youth. As a result, she conducted interviews with over 100 residents in the 4 villages and made extensive field notes. Host mothers were a particular focus, as we wanted to know why they agreed to having student visitors stay in their homes, as well as their impressions of the students with whom they came in so close contact. All the respondents, including those not directly involved with the visits, were asked to express their opinions of the ISL program's advantages and disadvantages for the community. The interviews were audio recorded and many were subsequently transcribed. In addition, authors conducted individual interviews with 10 special Nicaraguan residents located mainly in Managua, who were directly involved in developing and coordinating ISL programs in Nicaragua for Canadian and US students. We were particularly interested in gaining their perspectives, both on the intentions and undertakings of these programs, as well as on reasons why host communities may choose to participate in ISL visits. The surveyed residents of the participating villages were unanimous in their opinion that the programs were very positive, benefited the community and everyone involved, and that they should be continued. Not one respondent spoke in opposition to this. As one father expressed it, quote, "Here we had no school, there was no school, now there's a school because of the groups." In addition to the material benefits gains through the visits, most, if not all, the respondents felt there was some perhaps even more important benefits. As one explained, quote, "Well, because before we were used to live as if we were on a forgotten trip, I guess isolated, eh? And they always come to work, and they have made the community progress a little more. Now we work together more and to support and each other in everything," unquote. Another effect of the visits, noted by many, were the close social and personal relationships that developed between the visitors and residents, young and old, despite the relatively short length of visits, 1 week or less in many cases. Typical quotes included, quote, "We learn about other aspects of life because at night they would talk to us about their lives. It's not at all comparable with what we have here," unquote. And, quote, "We spent lovely moments with them. They taught us and we learned from them and we taught them. It was lovely to be with them." For their part, what was common to all the program leaders interviewed is that they recognized that the visits had an impact on the communities, some of which they reviewed as being positive, while others less so, in some cases even harmful. Several issues were raised by the program leaders, which included the learning objectives of the trips, the role played by community members in helping define and deliver that learning objectives, the timing of the trips, decisions about the arrangements made that impact women of the community, accommodating the members' visitors' sensibilities, communications, material benefits, non-material benefits, and post-trip issues. It became clear to us that in many ways, these issues were linked to each other, and all of them pointed to a common concern. Unless conscious and collaborative efforts are made by both the host community leaders and the leaders of the visiting groups, the host community will remain subordinate in the ISL relationship. In addition, one project leader raised concern about the possible long-term effects of traditional ISL programs, the creation or reinforcement of dependency relations between North and South. We ourselves had noted this as well in the context of community residents' comments to the effect that they could hardly wait for the next ISL visit, when another benefit, like a new schoolhouse or improved playgrounds, etc., would be confirmed on them. Thus, they were unlikely to take the initiative to raise the necessary funds through the appropriate levels of Nicaraguan government. On another note, one former program leader also recalled a village wanting the visitors to purchase paint so that they could brighten up the walls of the local cemetery, something the group leader was unwilling to consider, as the proposal did not relate to interests of the sending group. These differences clearly raise the issue of partnership and North-South relationships. If a request is made in a first encounter with a potential host community that is rejected because it was counter to the sensibilities of the sending agency in the global North, quote, "Where does that take us?" the former leader asked. Quote, "How might the relationship unfold from that point?" In contrast to the villages, who interviewed respondents were unanimously positive in regard to the experience of hosting ISL student visitors and the desire to continue these programs, we were fortunate to hear about another Nicaraguan village that had decided to say no to hosting ISL visits anymore. In our investigation with this village, we found that they had had this benefit for many years of hosting students from a progressive US Jesuit-based university, which worked in solidarity with the village to plan and undertake ISL visits on the basis of meeting the village's interests or expectations. However, when the university had to cancel their visits for economic reasons, another US-based NGO took over sending groups, one which had a very different North-South perspective on their program. These routines soon suggested to villagers that little had been done in advance to sensitize visitors to the village's culture and values, and the latter's expressed interest in promoting mutual respect and solidarity. After several attempts to discuss these issues with reps from the sending organization, they terminated the visits. All of our findings left us wondering in what ways might the lessons learned help us to provide a more authentic experience for ISL visitors, and in doing so, perhaps even insist in decolonizing the traditional power relations, which seemed all too often to underpin contemporary ISL program exchanges. How could students' interactions with host villages be based on social relations of solidarity rather than charity, thus providing the potential for making a difference in their experience and that of the villagers? Next slide. Based on our findings, we helped organize an encuentro, a gathering, involving 27 residents from 4 Nicaraguan and 4 Guatemalan communities, which was held in Managua, Nicaragua, over 3 days in August of 2017. Next slide, please. At that time, the participants discussed their experiences hosting ISL groups from the global North. Despite having many positive recollections, these host community representatives also identified several issues of concern. For the research team, the most striking thing that emerged from the encuentro was that the discussions identified a far greater level of critical perception than had emerged from our one-on-one community-based interviews. A number of crucial concerns emerged, all of which related one way or another to the need for a foundation of respectful ISL partnerships. However, one emerged as a key to all the others: the nature of the planning and decision-making process prior to and during the visit, and the importance to the host communities that their visitors respect local protocols and customs. As a result of this discussion, the Encuentro group developed solutions that could help Global South host organizations and villagers better articulate their expectations of their northern visitors, and to insist that northern sending agencies become more responsive to their southern host expectations, essential to developing what we are calling allyship in their relationship. Next slide, please. As a reporting session was held on the final day, during which time representatives of local and regional nonprofits and NGOs, whose roles and vocational interest intersected with the ISL programs, were invited to hear and respond to a presentation of the Encuentro discussions delivered by the participants. My colleague Luke Hildebrecht will now discuss the ways in which allyship can help ensure that these new expectations are met.
Hello, everybody. And thanks, Harry, providing all that overview of the project and the context, and then some stories and examples of our findings and recommendations, I think is a really important starting point for this presentation overall. Now, my portion here is going to be a little bit more reflective. Our thinking after this project, so post-project, and then in between the next one that we had hoped to apply for, really led us to think about our relationships with our sort of like bicultural relationships with a research team within Guatemala and Nicaragua, and the nature of co-creation of research. And so this is where Harry mentions the notion of allyship. I think that was a foundational component of how we applied for a second follow-up project on this this topic. So I'm framing it as lessons learned in allyship, partly because I mean, myself, I've been thankful to be a part of this ongoing work since 2016. Visiting the communities and building relationships has been an absolute highlight. My trip in particular to the Ixil region in Guatemala was really important. Being invited into people's homes, sharing food, drink, that sort of like informal aspect of life. And the Encuentro, which Harry spoke to there, I think helped deepen these connections. We had spent time traveling and making trips to the various communities as a research team, but that gathering, that coming together was, I think, essential in shaping our understanding of becoming allies in research relationships. Now, broadly speaking, I think allyship is always very particular and unique to the context of the relationship that one is in. So we weren't going to just claim, oh yes, we are allies. We really wanted to lean on and ask those whom we're working with what allyship meant to them. So when I talk about lessons learned, I think that's an appropriate framing rather than saying definitively this is what allyship and research looks like. This is simply a reflection on our own learnings of allyship in the context of this research that Harry outlined. So I'll talk a lot about research partnerships as well, and specifically community-based research partnerships, because that's really the core or the heart of these two projects. Something that is important in community-based partnerships is the investment that we have in them, and not just to the researchers on the ground in these locations where we're working, but how aware is the community, broadly speaking, of the research work? And I think that connects to whom we're working with and whom we have hired for this project, because we really want the co-creation of research to shine through at a broadly, like a community level. So the community having agency, which again, I think Harry highlighted in what he had spoken about as one of the outcomes, is a critical aspect of any community-based work. Without agency, there's no transparency and a lack of trust, and being able to build allyship with communities is definitely a complicated thing if that is the case. So a few stories. I think our commitment at the beginning of our second project was to decolonize the research process. That may be a theoretical piece at first, but who defines decolonization was really the starting point for us. And we wanted to ask our our community partners, what does decolonization mean for you? We don't see it as simply an academic component, but how is it felt and articulated by our communities? So the efforts of decolonizing research meant thinking differently about our methods, our processes, our expectations, and our outcomes, and that these should be led by our Indigenous community partners. So one example in that previous project that Harry had shared about was the Encuentro. This was really a community-to-community exchange. It was a validation of our findings, and it was designed by, with, and for communities. The second thing was the hiring of local researchers, and this decision to hire, train, support, and be in good relationship with a Guatemalan research team was critical to our efforts in terms of decolonization. It was really a starting point, and we started with pre-existing developed relationships that we had made during the previous grant. In this way, we could then also think about harnessing this ever-evolving use of Zoom and other online tools to work as a bicultural international research team and learn from one another. And some of the dynamics of that meant that we were becoming open and interested in the kinds of interview content and context that our Guatemalan team proposed. Spontaneity was a really important component. I think recognizing that honoring people's stories, whatever it may be that they shared, the gifts of these participants, meant that we encountered different types of data. I would say maybe even you could think about it as emergent data, which really is a very authentic kind of data. So I'll just highlight three broad lessons that we have learned and are still reflecting on. One is that people really do want to share their stories. It's important to be present, to learn from and with community members about their own objectives and goals, and realizing that, of course, community members at a broad level aren't necessarily as invested in ISL and IEE kinds of programs. And so the stories they tell weave those things with the stories of their lives and their own experiences within the community. And we have to listen to these community stories to really suss out the impact of these types of trips and programs. I think truly research does have potential to be a space for healing for people. And we have heard from our Guatemalan research team that the benefit to participants is in the sharing. It doesn't just lie in the writing of the papers or the long-term outcomes of a specific project, but it impacts people in the present when they're given space to share their knowledge and their stories. Just a personal example in some of the work that I'm involved in, I mentioned I'm working with an Indigenous wellness research group here in Saskatoon. As a project coordinator for one project that works with Indigenous women here in the downtown with lived and living experience with HIV and hepatitis C. We have completely integrated the concept of support groups or circles with our research meetings. And so they've become blended things, so enmeshed together that really the activities of research and the cultural activities and approaches to healing, sharing space and food and becoming well together are one. And I hope and think we've also created these same kinds of opportunities with our local research to do the same in the spaces that they share with participants in Guatemala when they go into their homes, invite them to tell stories, follow their Indigenous protocols, and listen. So one of the other lessons, lesson 2, is recognizing the loyalties to other commitments for community researchers. I probably already said this, so this may be redundant, but we need to realize that our employment of local researchers is but a fraction, right, of their social network within the community, and they don't have a full-time commitment to these projects, and their lives and their perception within the community are often a much more important thing than the kinds of perception that they have as a researcher. So we've learned to respect their time and their processes and know that their expertise extends to their use of their Indigenous protocols, appropriate relational contexts for work, and we'd never honestly be able to replicate what they're doing. And so we really honor the way that they're doing research. And so Western partnerships need to be flexible, open to change. Change in methodologies or theory shouldn't be imposed. And I think malleability, and I guess just openness to new things is really, really important. I think in particular, we're looking at Guatemala, and some of the local and national political dynamics need to be considered, especially in terms of timing and impact on our researchers. And the third lesson we want to highlight is just understanding data, and I put it in quotes deliberately, limitations. Just a little story, when we first were receiving some of the transcripts of the initial interviews, data was different maybe than expected. I think there were many stories that the participants were sharing that, like I mentioned earlier, sort of wove in between life and international service learning and other things. And the way that the questions were asked by our local researchers invited that sort of sharing, that reflection on their own lived experience. And we're really learning to love the kind of data that our researchers are gathering. The conversational approach that they're employing reveals things that maybe at first glance feels tangential, but are nonetheless extremely important. And so really it's more of a confronting ourselves. We're challenged to perceive of the storied types of data, maybe data that doesn't directly address some of the questions, as actually being just as relevant and just as important. And we need to focus on our analysis processes, which again, I think are best done collaboratively with our on-the-ground Guatemalan researchers. So those are some of the lessons that we've learned and maybe some of the way that we're framing our allyship in these research partnerships. It's ongoing, it's iterative, use any of those words, checking in with our community researchers, I think is really important, asking how are we doing? Are we supporting you? What are the next steps? What do you need from us? So I guess really the role of allyship that we're learning is not doing the research ourselves, but focusing on that collaboration and co-creation in research. And at this point, then I'll pass it to Mike.
Thank you, Luke. So we've heard from Harry about what might be thought of as the historical context, and from Luke, the theorization of our collective work. The young Nicaraguan anthropologist who worked as our research assistant in Nicaragua was the team member who suggested that we provide the funding for a South-South gathering. The objective of this gathering, or the encuentro that's been referred to multiple times, was to give key informants an opportunity to share stories about the experiences of hosting global northern visitors and to respond to, and as it turns out, to move well beyond the themes that the research team identified as having emerged from the interviews. Harry has already mentioned the themes that I put up here simply to refresh your memory. The interventions at the encuentro, as Harry said, were far more critical than anything emerging, certainly from the Nicaraguan community interviews, with the clear exception of the interviews in the village that decided to stop hosting visiting groups. The fact that the tone of the interventions at the encuentro were much more critical than the input of the villagers who were interviewed. And despite the fact that most, if not all, of the delegates to the encuentro had themselves been interviewed, this raises an important question about how one gathers data at the community level that encourages a frank dialogue. But that is a topic for another day. During the encuentro, the delegates spoke of or depicted in skits what was, at the very least, inconsiderate behavior by group leaders, and at the very worst, overt colonial attitudes and practices by these educators. They frequently assumed that their priorities and the requests, indeed demands, that they made of their hosts would be widely seen as reasonable. Now, reasonable or not, the fact that these conditions were simply stated without discussion explains the frustration of the host organizations. So too was the common practice of listing activities that the global northern leaders wanted the community to organize, again without dialogue, nor frequently did the visitors ask what their hosts wanted the students to learn and to do while they were on their territory. The experience of hearing about the gap between the encuentro delegates' expectations and the practices of their visitors had a significant impact on those of us on the Northern research team who attended the encuentro. It led to an awakening in us of the importance to explicitly recognize the frustrations expressed, to seek to theorize them, and to suggest alternative practices to share with Global Northern group leaders and their organizations. This motivated the research team, in close collaboration with our Mayan friends and collaborators, to submit a proposal that Luke just made reference to for funding to deepen the research on allyship. We chose to focus this proposal on Guatemala because we felt that work with Indigenous communities was particularly important to examine. It also had the effect of motivating me to organize annual Brock University student visits to 2 of the Mayan regions that were represented at the encuentro, and to do so on the basis of the principles enunciated there. Now, time does not permit me to get into the research project, but Luke has made some reference to it. That project is now entering into its 3rd year, but I would like to say something about the impact of the encuentro on how my student trips are organized. To date, I have led 3 such student trips, with a 4th one now in the planning stages. The first of these was organized with the help of a couple who had lived in both of the territories which we would be visiting, and one of whom had been a facilitator at the encuentro, so they both knew the delegates well, and both were fully aware of the recommendations that those delegates had made with respect to their expectations of Global Northern visitors. With one exception, an event to which I apparently attached more importance than did our hosts, the 3 trips to date have gone very well. As for what I consider to be the one event that led me to do some decision making and take it into my own hands without consultation, time limitations restrict me to saying that it involved me having to cut short a significant locally organized activity that I considered might compromise the health, safety, and well-being of some of my students. Assessing any possible risk as a group leader operating within the Canadian legal framework is a responsibility that on occasion cannot be shared. I felt very uncomfortable about taking this decision, and several months later, I made a special trip back to Guatemala and to that particular community to deal with what I thought might have been a point of tension between the local host committee and me. At a meeting of the host group leadership, I went into a detailed explanation of why I took the decision that I did. They listened patiently and then assured me that they understood the circumstances that led me to take that particular decision, and suggested that we plan the next trip and not worry about the last one. I am convinced that their attitude reflected the solid relationship that had developed as a result of the Global Northern team's acceptance of the essential message of the encuentro. It certainly helped that 2 of the delegates to the encuentro who actively supported the student visits were key members of the host committee, and that they were highly respected local Mayan leaders. Both were knowledge keepers, and both, Anna and Feliciana, would become the acknowledged leaders or alcaldesa of the local traditional Mayan governing council. Their support and that of the rector or president of the Ixil University, another important institution in the Ixil region, has been indispensable in allowing me to organize my student trips within the spirit of the principles enunciated at the encuentro. My acceptance that the local host committee was the best place to develop our agenda gave us legitimacy and access to a wide range of local people who the host committee had selected as people my students needed to learn from. This relationship of trust greatly enriched the student experience and, in effect, gave me permission to make an individual decision about student safety without being called out for it, even though some of the host committee members might have privately thought that this should have been a decision taken collectively. The Ischil University is a particularly important institution for my students to understand the process of getting beyond focusing on the victimization of the Mayan people and focusing on the revitalization of Mayan values and practices. The local Ischil leadership attaches a great deal of importance to this indigenous university that is autonomous from the state and operates not in Spanish, but in the Ischil language. It teaches Mayan history, philosophy, traditional agricultural techniques, including herbal-based health treatments and how to grow those herbs and so on. Much of this happens outdoors and using hands-on practice. My students refer to the Ischil University as the university without walls. The Ischil University is, in short, an important space that revitalizes the Mayan culture after centuries of persistent efforts, first by the Spanish conquistadores and later by local elites to undermine that culture. The challenge for a group leader, such as myself, is to prepare the students for the horror stories of the war period and those abuses that are still perpetuated, and not just by state agencies such as the military. Violence is still a widely practiced measure used by the armed security agencies of private interests, including by Canadian corporations, most notably those many Canadian companies involved with mining and damming rivers for hydroelectric projects. It is thus far too easy to fall into depicting the Mayan people as victims and underestimate the cultural recuperation strategies widely practiced by the local leadership. The balance that is necessary to infuse in any preparatory material prior to taking global northern students to a place where violence has been and continues to be deeply infused in the fabric of daily life is to show them that significant efforts are being made to encourage the flourishing of Mayan cultural values and to assert their demands for self-governance. The passing of traditional values and practices is occurring in multiple ways, including the establishment and functioning of traditional Mayan governing councils with leadership provided by people such as our friends and collaborators, Anna and Feli. In fact, Feli is the woman in the forefront of this picture, a young woman to have been honored with the position of alcaldesa in a governing council. It's usually older people that play that role. And the two young women in the other picture are running an herbal farm where they're growing what is needed for the traditional crops. So in effect, these governing councils act as a form of parallel power to the formal state-sanctioned institutions of local power, including the formal municipal structures dominated by non-Indigenous local elites. During our visits, we have seen the efforts made by the local leadership to provide their fellow Ischil citizens, young and old, but especially the young, the opportunity to embrace Maya culture, beliefs, and practices. Consequently, a flourishing of Mayan values and practices are emerging and include young people, some of whom, a few, want to return to practicing traditional agriculture, and others, like many of the young people we have gotten to know, are studying or have completed their studies in disciplines such as law, physiotherapy, auto mechanics, and public health. These four examples are taken from individuals with whom we have collaborated. These young people are now providing or are preparing themselves to provide the skilled talent that their people need from within their own ranks. Rather than being depicted as victims, the Mayan people want it to be known that these supposedly victimized people are engaging in an ongoing struggle to reassert their values and gain access to professional and economic opportunities, while continuing to attach importance to the functioning of their organizations of self-governance and maintaining a sense of pride in their ancient culture and the dignity that this pride makes possible. This is the story they want to tell. This is how they want to be depicted, and this is what they want visitors to learn while on their territory. Who better to tell this story to my students than these people themselves? Thank you, and I'll pass it over to Ashley.
Hi, everybody. It's a real honor to be a part of this panel today. I'm so grateful to Harry and Mike and Luke for welcoming me back onto the team. I come to this experience, I think, with a bit of a unique experience in that I have been both a participant of international experiential learning. I worked on the research, the early phases of the research project with Harry, Mike, and Luke. And then I also lived and worked in Nicaragua for almost 5 years as the director of an organization called Casa Pueblito. And as such, I was coordinating international service learning trips for high school and college students with various communities in Nicaragua. I think that having my own personal experience with international experiential learning was really crucial in gaining the perspective that I had for both the research and then my work as an ISL coordinator. And it's because I had such a great experience that was based in solidarity practices rather than sort of a charity viewpoint of ISL, and was more aligned with many of the suggestions and recommendations that eventually came from community members about what ISL should look like, that I think really gave me a great grounding in principles like allyship and sort of shifting the power balance from the global north to the communities that we were visiting. So the first trip that I went on was for 3 months. I lived in a rural community in Nicaragua. I learned Spanish, and the focus for my trip was really on building relationships and witnessing the day-to-day lives of the community members and the family that I was living with, rather than my volunteer work being any real benefit to the community, because I very quickly realized that it was not. And coming to the understanding that hearing the stories and sort of standing beside community members and their day-to-day lived realities was actually the purpose of the trip, really helped prepare me for my future experiences. As such, I came to understand that relationships really are foundational for a lot of the aspects of allyship that Luke mentioned in his in his talk. So particularly community members having agency, there being transparency in the relationships and the decisions that are made, and that there are trust between community members and the organizers of ISL trips. As the experience with the Encuentro illustrated, and from some of what Harry spoke to, it was often really hard to get community members to be honest about their experiences, reservations, and perspectives, precisely because of the power imbalance that's inherent as in my position as a coordinator, somebody who brought projects and brought student delegations to communities. And these trips, as has been mentioned, do bring concrete material benefits to communities. And oftentimes it's hard, if not next to impossible, to get around that, to really hear the reservations and concerns of community members without having a really strong foundational relationship of trust, or, as the Encuentro illustrated, a collective space where people could connect and share their perspectives together. So one of the biggest things for me was the primacy of relationships, and really trying to be honest and examine the power dynamics that were present in communities. So one of the things that I was always careful to do in my position as a coordinator was to spend a lot of time getting to know community members, getting to know community leaders, attending community events, spending the night in the communities and getting to know different folks, visiting for things other than the coordination of trips and other than the coordination of projects, and really kind of having a human relationship beyond my role as a coordinator and their role as a community that was receiving groups. My parents would come to visit me in Nicaragua, and I would bring my parents to meet the community members, and so that we felt like we had more of a shared connection. I had gotten to meet their families; they were finally getting to meet mine, and I found that those were things that really helped. As Luke mentioned, things like sharing food, sharing in events and different celebrations was huge. I also approach the work a lot of the time with, an opinion of knowing that I don't know everything, that community members do actually have an agenda for student visits. They have things that they would like students to learn, stories that they would like them to carry back to Canada. And for me, it was about trusting that community members were able to design an agenda or design an itinerary, a learning curriculum for students that would fulfill the needs that they were hoping to get out of the trips as well. I think the other piece that I think it really stands to be emphasized is, what does it mean to decolonize, international experiential education? Is it really possible? And I think that the thing to keep in mind, or for me, that I always want to be careful of, is that decolonization isn't just a buzzword, but it actually has to have material consequences for the communities that we're visiting. So it means community members having agency. But for community members to have more agency, it means that schools and sending organizations need to give up control. And so what does it look like to share power in many of the ways that Mike has spoken about? What does it look like to actually share power and relinquish some of the control that teachers, particularly group leaders, have over the experience that they have kind of preconceived? So in my perspective, the success of the trip for both parties was really based on the successful preparation of teachers. Sorry, next slide, Luke. The successful preparation of teachers and students, and a willingness on their end to relinquish some control over the experience. I noticed that there were real clear differences for me based on the teachers that were leading the groups. Some of the students and student groups that I worked with came from Catholic school boards who had a really strong focus on charity and volunteerism being part of kind of a charitable experience, and others who were more deeply embedded in the solidarity movement with Nicaragua in the 70s and 80s. And the difference in perspective between the teachers that were running the groups had an impact on the way that students perceived the trips. And that also played out in the ways that students and teachers interacted with communities. One of the challenges was definitely kind of the entitlement and some of the ownership that teachers feel over communities and the experience. There's one trip that will always stick out in my mind. We had teachers visiting a community that we had historically had a very close relationships with. I had close relationships with the cooperative leaders in the community. And I got a call from the coordinators that were supporting the trip while students were in the community, saying that there had been a conflict between the group leaders and the community members because some other friends of the community who were visiting Nicaragua from France had showed up to the community and were planning to stay for a few nights and visit with the community. And the teachers were upset because they didn't know these strangers that had shown up in the community, and they didn't think it was appropriate for other people to be there. But we really had to have a conversation with the teachers that, they don't own the experience. The community is not exclusively theirs for the time that they're there. And that people who are, friends with the communities have rights to come and go. The community members have an understanding of what's safe for students, what's not safe for students. And that was a real point of tension that thankfully we were able to resolve because myself and the coordinators that were working with the student groups had these relationships with community members. But challenging that sense of kind of ownership over the experience that some teachers have, and working to really shift power back into the hands of the community and give community members more agency in deciding what's going to happen on the trips is a big part. Particularly knowing our communities having the knowledge that coordinators and the folks from the organizing agencies will advocate for them with students and teachers if issues come up. So I think I'm going to leave it there because I am trying to stick to time and leave some time for questions. I think we're right at the upper limit there. But yeah, just in short for me, the possibilities and potentials for decolonizing international experiential learning are based in relationship. As the other speakers have mentioned, it's based on allyship, and that concretely meaning a relinquishing of power and shifting power back into the hands of communities and community members who are kind of the experts of their own lived experiences.
Thank you very much, Ashley, and everyone else. I'm pleased to be able to invite you if you choose to communicate with us, to myself or any one of the other panelists about what they had to say. I invite you to send an email to me, and I will either answer it or pass it on to the panelist who is the most likely candidate to answer your particular inquiry. So what I don't see any questions, but what I would like to ask Luke to do is to pull up the PowerPoint slide in Harry's presentation that shows people standing around with Anna dead center and several other people around her. If you can do that, I'll just make a comment about them and life in the Ashil region as it impacts some of these individuals. Is that possible, Luke? There we go. I'm going to start with the young man on the right in the red sweater. He is in exile now in the United States. He was the most amazing community activist, committed to his people, committed to their rights, and he ended up getting successive death threats. And in Guatemala, that has to be taken seriously. So he left, not for the United States. He got to a border city in Mexico, where, given his instinct to organize, he started to work with the migrants who were seeking the opportunity to get across the border to the United States, who were living in horrific conditions. And he ran into trouble with local gangs that thought that they were the ones that controlled that area, and he was not welcome. So he got further death threats and did make it across the border and was detained for a while, but is now living with one of those judicial orders that will not be executed for heavens knows how long. But he's not able to go back home, where of course he would prefer to be. The young woman who is standing beside the fellow in the black outfit, she's in the United States as well, not because she received death threats, but because of the dire economic circumstances. And she is now working in a chicken cutting plant in Ohio, where apparently there's any number of people from this region. And she went over wet, as they say, mojada, and last I heard was still there. The lady in the middle, who's front and center, that is Anna. And I mentioned Anna. She became, shortly after this photo was taken, when she was back home, she became the alcaldesa, the leader of the governing council, a very good supporter and friend of those of us on the team here. And unfortunately, Anna passed away about a little over a year ago. She was seriously ill and was hospitalized, taken care of as well as could be realized in the circumstances existing in the Ashil, but she passed away and was a tremendous loss to her community, and we lost a good friend. So it's fascinating to see that photo. I hadn't seen it before. and just to realize how difficult things have been, despite the fact that particularly the young man and Anna were in the forefront of the struggle for Maya cultural rights and self-governing rights and so on. Is anybody?
Michael, I see there's a couple of questions that are
Okay.
in the chat that I think are very good ones that we should grapple with.
Why don't you start then, Harry? Because
Well, one of them is
I can't see them. Yeah, okay, I see them now.
yeah, one of them is
One to Luke.
to Luke, and this one about the Michael Hooksman raises, I think, is an important one. Do the IE trips change the first world participants, or are these folks who are already open to thinking their own global citizenship? I say this as a former Canada World Youth member who's experienced many years of contact with other former CWY members who was apparently critical with worldviews. For my part, I found a very mixed response. I think that for sure, some students that came back really were changed in their perceptions about what happens in the South and the relations with the North, historically and in the contemporary perspective. Come back ready to try to do new things rather than the charity approaches that had taken in the past. I guess a good example of that was one student who came back, or at least a father that phoned the teacher who was involved. And the father was very upset. And the father said to the teacher very, very angrily, actually, my daughter, she went down there and she's come back and she's changed her university application request from doing work in economics and so on to doing world development and Latin American events and affairs. And he says to the teacher, how do you think I should feel about that? And the teacher, a friend of ours who doesn't take a lot of poo from anybody, just said, I think you should feel blessed. So some came back that way. But unfortunately, I think the majority come back just like more reinforced in the Northern perspective on things, the we versus they folks, the poor but happy and so on. So it is a challenge. I throw it open to other members of our group about that issue.
Yeah, I had responded just in a comment, but just to sort of paraphrase, I think it also really depends on the supports that are in place for students, particularly post-trip, and that the experience itself has, I think, a lot of potential to be transformational. But if there is not sufficient kind of supported critical reflection after the trip, I think that that kind of transformational potential kind of decreases. And I think it's really up to teachers and group leaders to support students in thinking critically about their experiences and kind of combating a lot of the stereotypes that Harry mentioned about people in communities being sort of poor but happy, if we really hope for the trips to be transformational.
I'm guessing, Mary Lou, that it's 2 minutes to the end of the session and you're going to make sure that we end on time. Is that correct?
We actually do not have another session for a few minutes, so I can give you maybe 5 minutes.
Oh, well, very good. I'm looking at Valdemar's comment about expecting a full renaissance of Mayan traditions with your and other decolonization interventions. I don't think any of us pretend that anything we do will have an impact on decolonization in the communities themselves, but rather we are attempting to decolonize ourselves and to create a literature that will be hopefully useful for global Northern leaders in the future to assess their practice as they prepare student visits in the future. But with respect to the process of a renaissance of Mayan traditions, I'm thinking about that a lot, and it strikes me that in the rural villages and small towns where there is less, if you like, distractions, less temptations, that there is undoubtedly a greater possibility for a broader establishment of a core group and growing group of people that are accepting of the values and practices of their culture. Where I think it's going to be a challenge is, for example, in the barrios of the urban centers where the Mayan presence is mixed in with people of other ethnicities, where youth gangs and so on are important, unfortunately, important parts of the reality that these people face. That's going to be tougher, and I'm not even going to speculate about that. Where we go, and particularly in the Ashil area, which is a rural area for the most part. The largest town, Neba, is 40 or 50,000 people, and then there are smaller centers. There, it's pretty vital. How widespread, and then how do you judge it too? Is a young woman who goes to law school in the capital less beholden to her culture than someone that stays in the community? And that gets into really complex questions about what does it mean to hold Mayan values, to engage in Mayan practices, and to live in an urban setting, or to be doing a job like being a lawyer or being whatever. So very complex, and I'm probably not going to satisfy you with that answer, because it really is something that needs to be studied deeply and undoubtedly by them, not by folks like me. Are there other questions that I've missed here?
I think Claudia mentioned something important about future presentations, inviting our Guatemalan researchers to join. I think in this particular case, I think the timing, and maybe Mike, you can speak to that a little bit more, is a particular challenge for our Ashil friends.
And if we set up a panel that importantly includes one or two of our colleagues, and Zoom isn't working that day, and that's frequently the case, we of course have frequent meetings with those folks, and frequently those meetings don't happen when we expect them to happen, simply because they can't get connections. The other thing that's going on right now, not that we knew this when we planned, but as you may or may not know, there are major demonstrations going on that have captured the attention and the energy and the time of our friends and colleagues, because there is an attempt to overturn, it sounds very Trumpian, overturn the election results. And the candidate who won is a progressive who beat an ultra right-wing candidate out. And prior to the election, they tried to get his political party declared illegal on some kind of legal technicality. And now that he won the election with a significant majority, they're trying to have the election called into question. So the folks that we deal with are making trips to Guatemala City, protesting in front of the presidential palace, and so on and so forth. But you're absolutely right. It's frustrating not to be able to include them because they have so much to say. And I wish several of those folks that we've mentioned could be here with us today. Anybody else, either on the panel or in the audience, like to have something to say? Well, again, I invite you to get in touch and direct your questions through me to anyone that's on the panel. And we find these kinds of engagements to be really, really helpful and focuses our thinking. So I would like to take the opportunity to thank Mary Lou for shepherding us through this. And to Katya and Javiera, the translators, that's not an easy job. Thank you very much for accompanying us on this journey that we've taken over the last hour. So I'll take this opportunity to wish everyone well, and I hope you continue to have a stimulating and thought-provoking experience. And best wishes to everyone.